It's just after noon Central Time, which means it's my privilege to welcome you to today's Alumni Career Webinar, Career Exploration, presented by A-J Aronstein. The Alumni Career Programs Office is committed to helping provide alumni with the resources they need to stay competitive in an ever-changing job market and support the alumni community with career resources, networking channels, and job search capabilities. Today's webinar is co-hosted by UChicagoGRAD, an office committed to serving the graduate and postdoc community, focusing on recruitment, skills and experience, career development, and alumni engagement. Today's webinar is presented by UChicago alumnus A-J Aronstein. A-J is a 2010 graduate of the Master's Program in the Humanities and is currently the Director of Graduate Career Development and Employer Relations at UChicagoGRAD. A-J will discuss how to begin your career search process. Whether you're just entering the workforce or looking to change careers, start the process by considering factors such as your preferred work environment, passions, and skills. A-J will help you lay the foundation for a career search that ends in success. He will also leave time to answer your questions at the end of today's presentation. So let me welcome A-J Aronstein.
Thank you. That's such a nice introduction. We're not used to getting such good introductions when we do these presentations live. So hi, everyone. My name is A-J Aronstein. Thanks for spending your, what is hopefully lunch hour. If you're here in the Midwest, it is sunny and about 45 degrees in Hyde Park, and we're all freaking out because it seems like spring is actually here. So it's very exciting. It is spring break this week, and this event, this entire series of webinars that will happen this week is part of March Term, an annual week of events that take place here on campus and farther afield. It's a series of programs dedicated to supporting students, graduate and current undergraduate, in their academic and career development. You can learn more at our website, which is grad.uchicago.edu. And as you already heard, UChicagoGRAD is a relatively new integrated one-stop shop for everything having to do with career development, fellowship advising, writing advising, oral communications consulting, and a lot more. And if you graduated from the University of Chicago any more than 2 years ago, this will sound all very new to you, and we've been extremely excited to provide these new resources to graduate students and postdocs at the university, and also to alumni who are 5 years or fewer out from their graduate program. I'll share information about how you can get in touch with us throughout the program today, and you're also always welcome to email me at aj@uchicago.edu. So one of the things I wanted to say is we will be putting a bit of a UChicagoGRAD spin on the way we do things this week, but all of our content should be appropriate no matter whether you graduated 2 seconds ago from a master's program or 20 years ago in a bachelor's program. We understand that a lot of you are interested in career exploration from different parts of your career, and we're excited to be able to present this week. You'll also notice that some of us in the office are children of the 80s. So for those of you who don't recognize the handsome Luke Skywalker standing there, you'll definitely get a sense of our various quirky sense of humor this week. I went with Star Wars for 2 reasons. So first, it was probably my first career ambition as a kid to try to be a Jedi Knight, and this is something that my parents unfortunately did not encourage me. Maybe fortunately, I don't know. I don't know that I ever had the ambition to be a university administrator, but here I am, and that's kind of one of the things that is interesting about careers. The second reason that I chose to go with Star Wars is that I love thinking about Star Wars characters as having jobs, about them kind of like struggling with their own anxieties about job applications, job hunting, like trolling through Indeed and LinkedIn trying to connect and network with one another. And so I thought that was kind of a fun, it's always been a kind of funny thing to me to imagine them as like bummed that they don't get the job as like Death Star engineer number 3. So this week we will be marching through 5 events on this webinar series, starting today, of course, with career exploration. I'll say more about that once we actually get going. Tomorrow we'll do job documents, and Joe Chai, who just joined our team and is really excellent, will talk about developing resumes and cover letters in line with some of the best practices that we've identified here at UChicagoGRAD over the last couple of years. On Wednesday, we'll talk about interviews and how you can make interviews more conversations rather than interrogations. At UChicagoGRAD, we have a lot of oral communications consultations with graduate students and postdocs from a range of programs before they go off and actually do interviews, increasingly on the phone, and especially Skype is a real new platform that people are really starting to use more. So we'll talk about some of that. On Thursday, a topic that's especially appropriate for the Alumni Association is we'll talk about leveraging the UChicago network and why it's not dirty or cheating to network. It's in fact the best way to identify potential paths for yourselves while you're actually applying for jobs at the same time. And we'll round it out on Friday with negotiation, which is often the most critical stage of any individual job search, but it's one that we often overlook because it feels awkward, uncomfortable, or in many cases especially intimidating to individuals who don't feel necessarily comfortable about arguing for their own value. But as I said, so today we'll start with career exploration. I want to talk first about the non-linear career and give some opening remarks about the shape that careers are taking these days and how that's inflecting the way that we talk about career exploration with the students and postdocs and alumni that we serve here. Before moving into questions that you have to ask yourself, I'm going to just say one more thing about the difference between a career search and a job search. You might think about today as our only career exploration day. The rest of the week this week will really deal with the nitty-gritty of the job search. Some of the things that I'll say this week, today will delineate what those specific differences are. At UChicagoGRAD, we talk a lot about the importance of cultivating a community of support around yourself when it comes to career development. And we like to tell advisees to pick people, not positions, when looking for jobs. And I'll go into that a little bit. And I'll round out what will roughly be the next half hour of just presenting with some strategies that you can take back into your own little cubicle wherever you are today, hopefully sitting outside on a beach somewhere sunny if you're on spring break, and leave you some ideas about how to create a strategy and some next steps for yourself, and then we'll open it up for questions. But first, what does it mean to actually conduct exploration? What does it mean to explore? I want to take a second to talk about career exploration as a kind of intellectual problem, something that often seems to resonate with the UChicago audience. I think we're used to thinking about the pursuit of jobs as a really distressing experience, as a kind of wholly separate activity outside from the way we're normally used to engaging in our work or thinking about ourselves. It causes stress because it forces us to put ourselves out there, that we are being judged. It's not just our work. There's something about interviewing, about talking to people, about applying to jobs, about sending resumes into these vortices of human resources that feels extremely uncomfortable to a lot of people, not to everyone. But I like to think about career exploration and indeed many aspects of subsequently applying to jobs as intellectual experiences themselves. What do I mean by that? Well, in the world where intellectual problems never have a solution, but only produce more questions and opportunities for investigation, career exploration similarly, to my mind, to our mind here at UChicagoGRAD, should be an ongoing process. It doesn't necessarily have a beginning or an end. Instead, if we maintain the perspective of something like the curious beginner, right? Always inquisitive, always asking new questions, always trying to interrogate what your own interests are, about what the interests are of different industries and positions out in the world, and about your own capacities to articulate how your skills and passions match with what the market demands, well, then I think you're constantly engaged and growing. So one thing I want to really leave you with today, if you leave with nothing else, is that career exploration is not a process that begins with a job application and ends with the final offer. Instead, it's something that is in the backdrop and should continue to be part of your self-reflection throughout the many jobs that you'll have throughout your career. That's the long way of saying this. Career exploration is an ongoing intellectual exercise in which you should consider your personal goals and skills first. Attempt to understand how these goals and skills can find homes, new homes, renovated homes, all kinds of homes, trailer park homes, I guess, in the broad marketplace. it's important to understand that this is a non-linear process, right? That's the first thing I really want to talk about with some specificity. It's the same way that all careers are ultimately non-linear. This is one of the first mistakes that folks tend to make when thinking about career exploration, is that careers move in a straight line. And I think this is not just nostalgia for a time when someone would get a job at GE at 22 and work their way through middle management all the way up to leadership over a 40-year period. There are reasons to suspect that that story elides all kinds of progress and setbacks and left turns anyway. But just because you're in a job for 40 years anyway doesn't mean that you moved in one direction while you were in that job. The other mistake is to conflate a career and a job. Career exploration is not, as I've said already, necessarily a job search. Or rather, a job search might fit within career exploration, but it is usually one point within the process of ongoing consideration of your long-term goals. The fact is that the average American worker today will change jobs roughly every 4.4 years throughout their entire career. That's the most readily and recently available number from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. That number is still slightly lower for millennials, but one of the interesting things that happened during the recession is that millennials, this 20s and 30s, seem to have been spooked. That is, they stayed in jobs slightly longer, in part because they were so grateful to have jobs and they didn't want to let them go. But it does seem like some of those trends, some of those micro trends between 2009 and roughly 2012 are starting to loosen and things are beginning to normalize. The funny thing is, at least at UChicagoGRAD, we often see graduate students and postdocs approaching all work like professors. It can be really intimidating to look at tenure-track faculty here and know that you have ambitions for academic employment and realize that maybe your first job will really determine where you work for the entire 35 or 40-year career that you then go and pursue. But this is really not the case that this model doesn't necessarily apply. It doesn't apply at all, in fact, to careers in industry, nonprofits, and government. And really, the model isn't even true for academia, where even professors move between institutions, they pick up private consulting gigs, move into industry or nonprofits as administrative leaders, or pursue administrative roles on university campuses. That is, even for professors, career exploration can be a good exercise. Regardless, your first job is not going to be your last job, and that's almost always the case. It probably won't even be, if you have something like a 30 or 40-year career, probably won't even be your 8th to last job, at least these days. At the same time, this fact shouldn't overly color your expectations for the next job that you apply to. To embrace the idea that you'll change jobs several times in the course of a career is one thing, but to start career exploration from the perspective of, I just need a job, sometimes something that we often hear is not always productive. There are certainly times in our lives when a job is something that we need sooner rather than later. But it's not necessarily the right idea to think about the two as wholly divorced from one another. You might say that a job is something that you might need in the immediate, but you shouldn't blind yourself to the fact that just because you will change jobs soon, potentially, that shouldn't inflect necessarily the quality or the caliber of the content of the job that you're applying to. It's a long way of saying, though, that the job search can take a little longer than we are used to thinking about it. And indeed, a career takes years and years and years to unfold. The important thing throughout the process of crafting a career for yourself is to see the whole picture and to find a balance between what your long-term goals are and then think about your short-term decisions. It's tricky, though. How do you find this balance? Well, patience. I'm not going to do my Yoda impression for those of you out there. Hopefully, you can all, maybe if you want to call in later, you could do your Yoda impression for me. But patience it takes. Specifically, it takes patience with the ebbs and flows. If you buy into my argument that careers are nonlinear, and I'll try to prove that a little more in a second, then it takes patience with setbacks, it takes not getting too high with progress, it takes understanding that a career unfolds over decades. When we think about other people's careers, we're used to seeing only the beginning and the end, or where people are currently. From this vantage point, it can often look like someone progressed in a smooth line from their nascence as an undergrad at UChicago all the way through whatever leadership position or special director role they have now. But I like to think of Luke Skywalker's career here, just really quickly, if you'll indulge me. So if you look only at the beginning and end of Luke Skywalker's career, and there are spoiler alerts here, so if you haven't seen the latest movie, maybe you can mute me for the next couple of minutes while I'm on this slide. But think about Luke's career. From beginning to end, it seems like he started as a dusty little farmer, a moisture farmer on his home planet, and he ended up retired happily on a rocky crag in the middle of the ocean, just kind of hanging out. Well, he had to pursue quite a difficult path, right? And this line elides all sorts of setbacks along the way. So he starts off as a moisture farmer, but he quickly decides that his skills with maintenance can help him get into the Rebel Alliance. And he gets a new job. He leaves his home, and he joins the Rebel Alliance as an X-Wing star pilot. He gets a big promotion when he successfully blows up the Death Star. Obviously, this is a real high point in his career so far. But then, after some career exploration and the ghost of his former teacher, which, by the way, if you have a ghost of your former teacher to give you career advice, they're always really useful. He ends up making a little bit of a left-hand turn and getting a new job as a Jedi Knight, which his training with Yoda, I was thinking about this last night, it's not like going to graduate school, you know, like a grumpy advisor sitting on your back, muttering like absolutely incoherent things into your ear and telling you to do the impossible and lift your X-Wing over Regenstein Library or something like that. Luke then gets a job offer from a competing company. It's actually the family business. That's the dark side, of course. And he hems and haws, and ultimately this potential career shift is a disaster. I mean, he loses his arm. It's really tough. And it takes some refocusing on his long-term career goals to eventually get back into the Rebel Alliance, save the galaxy, and, of course, now be celebrated as the hero that he has become. Right? So I know this is a little bit silly, guys. Stay with me. You're not going to save the galaxy in your career. But it turns out that throughout this, it's not the beginning and end points that are most interesting. Instead, it's the narrative that is most compelling. It's the narrative that holds our attention. It's the narrative that we actually value at all stages of our career. But how do you build that narrative? So here's how I think that you need to proceed through the next couple of phases of career exploration. I want to start with questions that you should ask. And I think that one of the reasons I want to start here is because we're not used to thinking about career exploration starting by inner reflection. We see a lot of students and postdocs here who are used to trying to identify job descriptions right out of the gate. They're looking for answers on big search engines that have associate director positions and director and senior positions, and they're thinking about experience, and they're thinking about all of these different things. And when it comes down to it, I find that those who are most effective at career exploration, about really thinking about how their short-term and long-term goals match up with one another, really begin with themselves. So I think the first set of questions you need to ask yourself when you're thinking about your career, what activities do you enjoy? And I'm not necessarily talking about playing hologram chess with your pet Wookiee and your robot, though it can be helpful to think of your hobbies as potentially useful in considering how you want to spend more of your time. By the way, the side note here, I hope that you all saw that a robot beat a human like handily in Go a couple of weeks ago. This Google software just destroyed the reigning champion. It's all to say that, you know, maybe we don't have to worry about careers because the robots are going to come and enslave us soon enough anyway. I don't know. For now, I think we need to still talk about it. What I am talking about when I'm asking you to consider activities that you enjoy, I want you to think about what about your work you most enjoy. At the same time, I want you to think about what about your work you least enjoy. It's almost as important to understand these questions, these two polar sides of the same equation. Do you enjoy research? Do you enjoy writing? Do you enjoy being around people? Do you enjoy presenting your work? Do you enjoy coming up with new ideas? Do you enjoy implementing? So in doing this, it can be helpful to think about the way that you work through problems. Do you like to create new answers to old questions? Are you a person with big ideas? Do you really enjoy the nitty-gritty of figuring out steps towards the integration of a solution? Do you like being on a big team in a group? Or do you like to spend more of your time thinking solo? Just a word of caution here. There's a knee-jerk response for many graduate students. They like to solve and think alone. It's part of what doing intensive research at UChicago is about, really, at any level. But almost all workplaces are intensively collaborative when it comes down to it. If you work alone and you enjoy that, it might be best to think about how you can do research alone and then present it to broader audiences, sharing the stakes that your work actually has. I do think that you should be asking yourself what you do in your spare time. Are you volunteering in the community? Are there causes that you're especially passionate about? Are you on the board of a nonprofit organization? Do you find yourself writing? Do you find yourself writing for a public, like on a blog or somewhere in the vast online world that we inhabit most of our time? Are you working on a business plan for a startup? Are you excited about tech? All in all, you need to ask yourself why and how these kinds of things bring you joy. What does it mean that you spend your weekends hiking and you kind of dread going back to the office on Monday morning? What does it mean that you like being in a different city so much? What does it mean that you want to be closer to your family and you spend your spare time traveling back to New York or wherever you're from? Another thing you should be asking yourself is, what kind of people do you want to be around? And there's, of course, an old joke that no one would go to law school if it was called lawyer school instead. And that is because, I hope there are no tax attorneys on the line or something like that, but everybody wants to be a constitutional law scholar, but few people want to have lunch with lawyers every day for the next 40 years. That's the way the joke goes. Respectfully, again, to any attorneys. I looked this morning and nobody from the law school had signed up, so I hope you don't skewer me for this. But what kind of people do you want to have interactions with every day? The people that you work with are the people that you will likely spend the most time with, and it's important that they share similar passions, similar excitements, similar ways of reflecting on the problems in front of them to produce something good for clients, for students, for other people, to produce impact in some way that matters to you and to them. And then there are, of course, a lot of other considerations, and I don't think that these necessarily should come from things that we're not necessarily used to thinking about in the context of career exploration. Your proximity to family, preferred geographic regions, what your leisure activities are. All of these might help you decide what will make you happy. It says something that if you want to spend your time outside and at the beach and in the mountains, maybe Chicago in February is not the place that you need to pursue your career. Maybe it will help your career to think about being happier and productive in a climate, or like, I'm thinking LA here, obviously. We're always thinking about Los Angeles and Chicago at the tail end of winter. But what are the things outside of the jobs themselves that will motivate you, that will keep you happy in the context of your work? Okay, so let's say you figure out the things that you're passionate about, the things that make you happy, the things that drive your interest. Now it's important to think, we're still thinking about just you, just thinking about yourself. There are some tools out there that can help you identify skills. There's Strengths Quest, which I think is a pretty good one. There's, of course, MBTI, the good old Myers-Briggs. For scientists, there's a tool called MyIDP, and through UChicagoGRAD, through UChicago generally, you have access to a tool called Versatile PhD, which if you're a graduate student is especially helpful, but really for anyone, they have a skills identifier which can help you think through some of the competencies that you actually already have. But I want to basically give you a frame of thinking through the skills that you already have, and I know that many of you are coming to this conversation today from different points in your career, but I thought we'd all share as UChicago graduates research skills, writing skills, critical thinking skills, and teaching skills. I'll talk about, I know teaching might raise a few eyebrows, but I'll talk about how you have teaching skills for sure. Research, writing, and critical thinking, we're used to getting told that those are amorphously the skills that we all have. And I think that too infrequently people don't dig down into what those words actually mean. So what does it mean to think about your research skills? And this is with an eye to some of the most common career paths that we're seeing produced right now. Data is huge. So do you enjoy working with data, hard evidence, and numbers? Are you a crazy ninja? Are you a Jedi master at Excel? Do you like seeing patterns? Data has become a huge buzzword across a lot of fields, and as more and more data is produced, lots of people are thinking about how to understand the data better. So if you enjoy data, that's great, but don't fear. I'm not thinking only of quantitative data here, because as we've gotten better at collecting data, we've gotten better at collecting qualitative indicators of certain measures measures of success generally. So even if you're thinking about qualitative evidence as a kind of data, maybe you enjoy working with data. Do you have experience with ethnography? That is, do you enjoy talking to people and getting to understand what makes them tick? Possibly articulating what makes them tick to other people, right? Ethnography is a huge skill to have. It's extremely useful in fields like sales, where you're trying to assess people's needs and then meet them. Do you have archival research experience? That is, do you know how to investigate obscure and difficult to identify materials, and then use communication skills, some of the writing skills that I'll talk about in a second, to articulate exactly why they have value? Do you have specific methods and approaches in your daily work that you think would have applications in other fields, other industries, other jobs? Methodologies that you enjoy employing, whether they're statistical or whether they're scientific, or whether you're in a position right now and you have a particular way of approaching things like social media, marketing, or communications that you think that method could work somewhere else. Technical skills are obviously huge, but I think we run into a lot of graduate students who are worried that they don't code. This is becoming a real concern, and the fact of the matter is, for most of the jobs that we see, it's a real asset to be able to have some kind of technical skills, but it's also really easy to get trained on the basics of these skills. The university now has a partnership with lynda.com, which is great on teaching several of these competencies. And we've actually heard from employers that doing something like taking a Coursera course on HTML or Python or R, don't be scared if you don't recognize these things that I'm saying, not everybody needs to have them. But if you're concerned about technical skills, then those are great ways to get trained up very quickly. If you're a scientist, we have a lot of scientists that we deal with here at UChicagoGRAD. Thinking about research as a management problem can be extremely effective when applying to jobs and thinking about a long career. Managing a lab is management. Managing a lab is kind of like managing a small research enterprise. You can think about it that way. Okay, what about writing? As students, you write in multiple genres and for many audiences. So you know how to tailor your communications to many different kinds of people in many different forms. That might be something like blog entries or social media, or writing content for a website, and not just a dissertation or a thesis project or a term paper or something that we're more accustomed to thinking about, the kinds of exercises that happen in the classroom. And I would imagine for those of you who have had longer careers at this point, there has to be some, I'd be curious to hear, maybe I'm totally off, but I'd be curious to hear how some of the writing skills that you developed in the various programs that you completed here might have applicability later on in your career. It's kind of interesting to think about the ways that your voice as a student evolves over the course of a career, but I think it's always something to have in mind. What are the origins of our ability to do things like report on large sweeping societal issues or create arguments? I think one of the things that a UChicago education teaches you is how to write argumentatively, how to support your claims with fact-based evidence. And I think that's not something that is, I think it's something that a lot of people enjoy from this institution, something that they kind of do instinctually after being here for a while, but something that really is rare out there in the world. I want to give a little credence to the management thing again. I think that writing is all about managing long projects. So if you're a student right now and you're managing a long thesis project or a dissertation, then you know how to manage a project from its conception as an idea through its execution as a final product, with all of the interim steps between. Okay, what about this especially hazy one, this critical thinking? It's a tough one for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, but I think it boils down to this. The first thing is, you all know how to distill information. Distilling is an incredibly important aspect of a lot of jobs. It's something you'll do throughout your career, taking vast amounts of information and boiling it down to its most important parts. Part of that is also curation. And so one of the things I think, if you enjoy critical thinking, one of the things I think you're enjoying is actually making choices about what is most important, and then synthesizing the different pieces of important information, putting them together. This is another place that I don't want to get qualitative folks, humanists and social sciences out there concerned, but you're also doing analytic thinking. And that can mean analyzing data for sure. It can also mean analyzing the intersection of multiple texts. It can mean analyzing market trends or consumer behavior patterns. Critical thinking means you're conducting research often in different languages, that you're detail-oriented in the way that you mobilize evidence to make your claims, and that you can also zoom out and look at the whole picture. So even though you're able to get down into the weeds and pick the evidence that's going to help advance your argument, you can pull back as well and see the whole frame in front of you. Okay, what about teaching? For those of you who have teaching or mentoring experience either at UChicago or elsewhere, I like to think of teaching in the context of thinking about a career as, at least if you're not in education itself. Obviously, if you have teaching experience and you're applying for teaching jobs, that's fantastic. It maps perfectly on. But for those of you who are unaware or maybe struggling with how to think about how your teaching can fit into a career in something else, teaching is really a little bit like client service. This makes a couple of people, this makes people that I've talked to feel a little bit icky to think about students as consumers. But when you're teaching undergrads, high school students, mentees, you are trying to respond to the needs of people who are interested in learning something from you. And for those of you who have taught undergraduates at the University of Chicago, you know how demanding it is. You know that they email you at 1 o'clock in the morning and they're freaked out about their assignments, and you have to do a ton of one-on-one mentoring and support. So it's definitely demanding. But it's also communications in a very, very important way. That is, you're often taking really complex ideas and reducing them to their most important and most understandable, most comprehensible iteration for audiences who very much might not be experts. Teaching is planning. It's managing a classroom. Notice that management still comes up, right? If you're managing 15 or 25 or even just one, if you're managing a relationship with one person, that's important. And it's about engaging with multiple stakeholders, faculty members, parents, if you're talking about teaching in high school. You're always thinking about how to convey what's going on in the classroom to other stakeholders that surround you. Keep in mind that these skills will evolve over the course of a career. They'll change. You'll add to them in different jobs. You'll think about how writing, for example, as I've mentioned, has different manifestations in the professional world than it does in the academic. You should hold on to these basic skills, I think, as foundational to the kind of professional that you are or will become or have become. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is how employers describe these skills. So at this point, I want you to start thinking about job descriptions. The idea here is essentially to match the skills that you have with the way that employers talk about the things that they need. So we always recommend that you read job descriptions with a pen and a highlighter and circle keywords, cross things out. I always say that job descriptions should be neonically yellow. I still print them out. I'm still a little bit, analog that way. I like to have the tactile pen and just like circle and draw connections and arrows and try to figure out what the common phrases are, what the common desired competencies are, what the common words are. Before you apply to any single one job, you have to think about job descriptions as a great way to collect data on diverse job types in industry, nonprofits, and government. You don't want to just look at one job description. You want to look at several before applying. You want to collect as much information as good UChicago students would, collect as much data as you possibly can, have a hypothesis about what the outcome might be, but then come to a solution only after analyzing multiple different entry points. Then you need to see if you can articulate your skills in the idiom of the job descriptions that are out there. In other words, the problem of matching skills to needs is not one of actual content. It's often a rhetorical problem. It's often a problem of simply articulating what you already have, but in words that are recognizable to an employer. I want to go back to that example of teaching, for example. We have a lot of students who want to get a start in something like marketing or communications, public relations. They have all this great teaching experience, and they say to me, well, AJ, I don't have marketing experience. I don't have public relations experience. I haven't worked with clients before. And I always say that teaching is precisely a communications problem. Teaching is precisely trying to take your perspective on an issue and trying to deliver it in a way that's digestible by a specific audience. It goes for the writing as well. And these are skills that you need to be able to translate for employers who might be skeptical looking at a resume that's teaching experience, and instead make that something like communications management, client service experience. I wouldn't worry about the years of experience required for specific positions at this point in your exploration. What you want to do instead is get a sense of the diversity of jobs out there and get a sense of the things that look attractive to you. One of the fun things about career exploration as opposed to job exploration is that when you're thinking about a career, you can look at positions that are 20, 30 years down the line from you and say, that looks like a really interesting endpoint. That looks like Luke Skywalker hanging out on a craggy cliff over the ocean, retired, right? But how do I get there? And knowing that what the endpoint is important, you just have to fill in the spaces between. I think mostly you have to also think about what you can be excited about getting out of bed for at 7 a.m. every morning, right? I get out of bed at 6:30 here in Chicago. It's like -10 out in February. The thing that gets me out of bed is knowing that I'm going to go and serve students, or sometimes I just talk into a microphone. This is a really strange thing for me, you guys. Like, I typically have an audience. I'm gesturing like a crazy person over here. It's very strange. But I like the idea of serving people, and that's what I get excited about every day. And if you can get excited about something related to the jobs that you're reading about, that is a really good sign that this might fit with what your career ambitions are. Ultimately, like I said, this is about what makes you happy. This is, by the way, the creepiest Han Solo smile that I could find online. If you find any ones that are creepier, please feel free to email me at aj@uchicago.edu. But really, the important thing to consider is what really excites you about a potential career. What makes you think that this is something you might actually want to be doing? Now look, when you're reading these job descriptions, you need to understand that job descriptions are not always jobs. They can be useful data, but often job descriptions are written by folks under crash circumstances. HR is the last thing that they know how to do, and the job actually might be quite different from what the job description says. And this is one of the reasons why when you're doing career exploration, it's important to think about people and not positions. What do I mean by this? Well, some of the common fears that we get when people come in with just job descriptions to talk to us about career exploration, they're worried that they'll be shackled to their desks, that they need to pay loans so someone can't afford to take a job in the industry of their choice right in the immediate. They don't want to have a 9-to-5 job, and I always say no one in the world has a 9-to-5 job anymore. Every job is all sorts of all over the place. Maybe they're not sure how this specific job will turn into a career. They can't find anything in the specific content area that they spent so much time studying and working on and caring about. And to all of these responses, I have specific things that I would say to each of these, but I think the most important for you all to know today is to pick people, not positions. When looking at jobs, remember that jobs are actually occupied by individuals, and those individuals have career stories, and they have the kinds of answers to questions that you might be interested in knowing. Job descriptions, that is, only tell a small portion of the story. A person has an entire history that includes things like current employment. So I pulled up, by the way, this is how nerdy I am. This is actually Paul Triton. That's his actual name in the movie. I didn't know that. I'm sure some of you all did. I have a sense of this audience. So he's the current director of Death Star social media engagement and community involvement, which is for some reason in New York. But on LinkedIn, this is a snapshot from LinkedIn, and we'll talk about this especially in our networking presentation in a couple of days. This has Paul's entire career history. So he's got the job that maybe you want or maybe would aspire to as a director level position. So you can see his current employment and identify with that. But I think that overlooked a lot in LinkedIn is previous employment. How did he get there? What were the steps that he needed to take in order to get there? He's also got his side pursuits up here. So this is where I go back to thinking about what you're interested in and what you spend time doing. I don't know if Paul writes poetry freelance or if he's a blogger or what, but it looks like he has at least something on his profile about writing. And actually, I pulled this from a real alum, Mike Washburn, who's the director of programs at the New York Council on the Humanities, and he actually writes for the Times on the side. It's something that he's spoken to me a lot about being passionate about and being able to continue to do in the context of his everyday job. The fact is, there's just plenty to ask about. So there's more to ask about here of someone who's had a long career than there is information in a job description. It's really funny, though, I can't emphasize this enough, that a lot of people start from this perspective of, I need to look at job descriptions to make my next career move. And I think that really what you want to think about is the people that you might want to be. Try to identify a narrative of someone whose narrative you might want to have in the next 5-10 years, and reach out to those people. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in depth when we get to networking in a few days. A word of caution here too, job descriptions can often be misleading too. They can sound great, but I also always advise that you should pick a boss and not a job. Your boss will have more control over your next job and your career trajectory when you're in a new role. Your boss will have the most control over that, likely. You'll have a lot of input, obviously, but a boss is an important person. In the best kinds of scenarios, you're picking someone and you're getting a feel of them in an interview, for example. Someone that's supportive of your goals, someone that understands that you're going to continue to explore the next steps in your career, even if you are in a job for them for the moment. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't mention something about compensation, and it's certainly something that you need to think about. I would just say that in the beginning stages of career exploration, and obviously many of you have current salaries that you're thinking about, but I think that in the beginning stages, when you're thinking about what matters to you most, thinking about money too hard can get in the way of what you're actually passionate about. I think that one of the best pieces of advice that I got in this when it comes to this topic was pick what you're passionate about and the money will follow. And I think that's really held true for graduate students that we've seen go on to different careers, often careers that they didn't expect, that they took entry-level positions in but moved very quickly after, because driven by their passion and their excitement, they excelled and they stood out because they have big brains and great qualifications. And I think that's something, it's important to think about money, but when you do, you need to definitely gather data on compensation. So websites like salary.com, like Monster, like Glassdoor are great for understanding what people are paid for positions, and also understand the cost of living differences that might accumulate over time. So a director position in Chicago will pay a lot differently than a director position in New York in, let's say, a nonprofit role, but it's a lot more expensive to live in Brooklyn than it is to live in, say, Pilsen. I know this because my girlfriend just moved to Brooklyn rather, and it's a little shocking. But I guess the point is you don't want to get blinded by numbers, right? You don't want to be surprised, and you also don't want to be fearful of thinking about a career move that will take you to another place. You should try to understand the premiums that are paid out to degrees. I don't get too much of this. When I do, it's a little disconcerting, but there's this idea that if you have a certain degree level, well, you should be making salary X. And sometimes people won't apply to jobs because the advertised salary is too low. And I think that's a real mistake, because you're missing the opportunity to prove to someone that you have a lot of qualifications and skills, and that in a conversation and through negotiation, you can actually you can help them understand what the value of your degree and training can be. I'd also encourage you to think about ways to pursue the content that you want to in different industries and places. So let's say that you really like education. You're really excited about higher education. I get a lot of this, of course. But you're worried that small education nonprofits aren't a good fit with the way that you'd like to be compensated in the next couple of years. There are ways to be engaged in meaningful and valuable work in, let's say, industry as an education consultant or as a curriculum designer for a textbook company, or any number of roles. So we often get people who are interested in career exploration, but they'll come and say to me, AJ, I'll do anything, but I won't work in the corporate world. And I think that that closes off a lot of different avenues right at the start, a lot of different opportunities. And it comes from a fear of not being able to do something meaningful or big, that will mobilize your brain. But I think that it really harms your capacity to understand potential trajectories on paths that you might not recognize at the beginning. I like to say this especially to earlier career people, and I hope that this resonates with folks who are a little bit farther out, but paying your dues can be a real thing. There are certain industries where you really have to start as the low man on the totem pole and work your way up. I do like to say that everyone makes the coffee. Everyone at some point in their long career is called upon to do the stuff that supports everyone else. And I think that understanding that going in and knowing that you're going to start somewhere is important to thinking about the kinds of roles that are open to you in at least the beginning of your career. But no matter where you're at, I would say it is very likely, as I said at the start, that your next job will very likely not be your last job. So how do we bring these things together? Just very quickly, how do you map this strategy out? So what I've talked about today is that it takes time. It takes time, and it's not a one-time thing. But neither is a job search. Job search won't be a one-time thing either, so you'll have many chances to go at this different ways over the course of your career. The first thing that we talked about today is to ask questions and identify preferences. From there, you should move on to articulating your skills, identifying the skills that you have and articulating them in the register of job descriptions that you've identified. Then you should move on to researching connections. And I think this is really an integral part. Mike Tessel will talk about networking on Thursday. I think it's really going to be a great presentation. Always is. We talk about it all the time because it's so important to connect with alumni, with friends, and with family. One of the amazing things about being an alum from the University of Chicago is just how ready other alums are to support one another in their career search. It's really shocking. We tell students it's not shocking anymore, I guess. We tell students and postdocs to reach out all the time, and 9 times out of 10 they get a warm response. And we are happy to help you craft those kinds of messages if you're hesitant or intimidated by reaching out at first. Then you move on to tailoring job materials. So we're getting into job search terrain here, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. So don't panic just yet. We'll help guide you through some of that if you need to brush up on those skills or you're just starting out. And you apply. And you apply to a job, and you hope it works out. And recognize that at any point in your career, you can move back up the chain here, right? So you're going to go from applying to researching new connections and starting over, to reading new descriptions and thinking about a new career. From tailoring job materials to connecting with alumni and friends that will help you understand how your materials might not work so well. And if you really have to tip over the cart and go in a totally different path, I think you can go back to asking questions about your skills and your preferences, but I really do think that that's something that you can do throughout your career. You should also be using your resources. So we got some questions about using resources at UChicago so that you don't crash into the AT-ATs as they invade Hoth. I really hope that they're Star Wars fans, otherwise this is probably pretty boring for all of you. I hope not. It's been fun for me. I encourage you all, regardless of what program you graduated from, to go to grad.uchicago.edu. There you'll find academic and career development resources. We have all of our presentations online, all sorts of guides on career exploration, but also on the nitty-gritty of the job search process. Upcoming on April 8th is GradUCon, our annual career conference. And if you are a current student out there, PhD, master's, whatever, you are eligible for UChicagoGRAD internships, and I'd love to talk to you about that. Throughout the year, we have career and skills programming. Some of it is broadcast online, so if you're farther afield, you can definitely tap into that. But all of our events are open to the public, and they're broadcast pretty regularly on our website, so you're welcome to join us if you're in Hyde Park or Chicago. Again, for current students, postdocs, and alumni up to 5 years out, we offer one-on-one intensive advising. So typically we talk about resumes, CVs, cover letters, career exploration, but we also have advisors dedicated to academic writing, oral communications if you need to prep for an interview. We actually have some of that going on right now as I speak. I hope I'm not interrupting with this talking into the microphone. But I also like to open it up now on the forum on what you need and questions that you have related to this presentation or anything else. But I am at exactly 35 minutes, so I am going to stop there and open it up to questions. And I did get one, oops, sorry. I did get one question in, and it says, regarding years of career, sorry everyone, I'm like losing the GoToMeeting here. Hang on just a second. Regarding years of career-specific experience required in job descriptions, how might having a PhD translate or compensate for a lack of direct experience in a specific career? This is a question we get a lot, and I think it's really, really something commonly done extremely effectively. So we'll talk about this a little bit in job materials tomorrow, but I think on a resume, for example, you should talk about the actual parts of your job as a doctoral student, as a teacher, as someone who manages a lab, as someone who conducts archival research. I advise PhD students to have an entry in their resume that says doctoral researcher, University of Chicago, and then breaks that down into all of the different things that you've done as a doctoral student. I think it's a mistake to necessarily think about a doctoral degree as equating to a specific number of years, especially because it can be strange to think about like 7 years of a doctoral program as like 2 years of like quote unquote real world experience. What's most important is to think about how the specific things that you've done map onto a specific job description. So I got one more question on how you get through HR filters to reach the hiring manager. It is hard! Exclamation point. And yeah, it is hard. We get this question a lot. I think that there's a lot of concern that there are robots screening resumes, and actually it is the case for something like USA Jobs, which is the collector of all government jobs in the federal government, at least in the U.S. There are programs that kind of troll through resumes and look for keywords, and you can worry about that if you want, but I think it's more productive to think proactively about figuring out UChicago alumni or other connections. Remember that you went somewhere for undergrad, so you have connections there too. And before you apply to any job, you should look on LinkedIn for people who are working at that company, organization, nonprofit, or government entity. So often it is really a question of being able to connect with someone who understands the role, who can help you first before applying. Because I think we've all been in the situation of sending resumes out into the vortex and then waiting for a reply that we kind of know isn't going to come. And I think it's much more productive to have something like a conversation first to help you understand how to make it through and who can be an advocate for you too. If that's not working, if you can't find someone, if you need to apply for something really quickly, I think the best thing is to cater your job materials in the way that we'll talk about tomorrow precisely to the job description. It is imperative that you have fidelity to what a hiring manager is asking for so that you can be passed through human resources. Sometimes human resources means, a pretty young person who doesn't really know the position too well and they're just looking for keywords, and as long as you're having fidelity to that, then you can get through. Sometimes it means a professional who's been around a lot longer and who can see where you're trying to articulate the value of your skills, but they need to see you doing that in their own idiom, right? They don't want to waste the hiring manager's time on a student or someone who's mid-career who's going to come in and talk about how excellent they are without having any kind of sense of how their skills map onto what the job actually calls for. Like I said, we'll talk about that a little bit later. I got a question from a lab school alum. Can you use grad.uchicago.edu? Absolutely. Our resources are all open, except for one-on-one advising, which is restricted to graduates of graduate programs and postdoctoral positions here at the University of Chicago up till 5 years out. But we do also welcome you at events that we hold throughout the year. I think that's all the questions that were out there.
Many thanks for joining us for today's presentation, and a special thanks to you, AJ, for this informative presentation. As a reminder, please watch your email for a link to the recording of today's presentation, along with a follow-up survey. We also invite you to join us online at careers.uchicagoalumni.org, where you will find upcoming events, webinar archives, our alumni jobs board, and a form to let us know when you have hired another UChicago graduate at your organization. Thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you at our next Alumni Career Webinar.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.